Right. So, picture this. It's 1887, East End of London. The streets smell like ambition, desperation, and things we're not going to think too hard about. Everyone's crammed into tenements so narrow you can hear your neighbour breathing. Between them was a woman, killed in her own home by the bloke next door, because she was polite to the wrong person. Welcome back. You might want a cup of tea for this one. Actually, this one's fine. Nobody's getting poisoned today. Probably. Miriam Angel was born around 1862, somewhere in the Russian Empire, into a poor Jewish family. Now, being Jewish in 1860s Russia wasn't exactly a comfortable situation. Persecution, poverty, violence, the full package. So, like thousands of others, her family eventually packed up everything they had, which wasn't much, and headed for London's East End. Which was, and I want to be clear about this, not the nice part of London. But it was theirs. And for immigrants fleeing something worse, that counted for a lot.
By 14, Miriam was already working. Long hours, crowded workshops, sewing garments for pennies. The kind of childhood that skips straight to adulthood without asking permission. But here's the thing about Miriam. She didn't just survive the East End. She was actively trying to escape it. She taught herself English. She read newspapers. She saved every penny with the grim determination of someone who fully intended to leave. Neighbours remembered her as cheerful. Genuinely cheerful, which, given the circumstances, is either a personality trait or a coping mechanism. Possibly both. At 22, she married a tailor called Barnet Angel. It wasn't a grand romance. Barnet worked long hours, often away. They lived in small rented rooms, saved what they could, and quietly built towards something better. Miriam spent a lot of time alone. Which is relevant, because someone noticed.
Israel Lipski arrived in London as a teenager, fleeing poverty, carrying the weight of relatives back home who were depending on him, running a tiny walking stick workshop that barely covered rent, let alone remittances abroad. Now, London had promised opportunity. The East End was full of that promise. Posters, word of mouth, the general mythology of the place. Unfortunately, the opportunity was not evenly distributed. Israel struggled. Where Miriam had found her footing, slowly, stubbornly, determinedly, Israel kept slipping. The city that was supposed to be his fresh start kept presenting him with the same dead ends in slightly different arrangements. People remembered him as charming when things were going well. Things were rarely going well.
And then one day, in the shared courtyard of their tenement, he noticed Miriam Angel. Now, a quick word about East End tenements. They were extremely small, extraordinarily crowded. Shared staircases, shared water pumps, shared courtyards. Privacy wasn't a concept so much as a rumour that had never been confirmed. Which meant Israel Lipski and Miriam Angel were constantly, unavoidably in each other's orbit. And Israel, bless him, decided that this was fate. He started timing his trips to the courtyard, lingering near the water pump, replaying their conversations in his head long after they'd ended. Miriam helped him understand official notices sometimes, because she was kind. They'd occasionally discuss life back in Eastern Europe, because they were neighbours. To Israel, these moments were the highlight of his entire week. Which, again, says rather a lot about how the rest of his week was going. To Miriam, he was simply the bloke who lived nearby. She had absolutely no idea she'd been cast as the lead in someone else's love story.
Eventually, Israel confessed his feelings. Miriam told him no. Clearly, and directly. She was married, she said. She wanted no rumours. She considered the matter closed. And that, for any reasonable person, would have been that. Israel was not, at this point, a reasonable person. What Miriam experienced as a brief, slightly awkward conversation, Israel experienced as a devastating, life-altering humiliation. She moved on within about 45 seconds. He did not move on. At all. Ever. Over the following months, he became increasingly creative in his interpretations of reality. A greeting from Miriam became encouragement. A smile became secret affection. Basic human politeness became evidence of a relationship that existed entirely inside his own head. He convinced himself she was simply scared of gossip, that eventually she'd leave her husband, that she'd choose him. The fact that she had never once suggested any such thing did not register as relevant information.
Meanwhile, Miriam was having quite a good time, actually. After years of saving and planning, she and Barnett were finally discussing a move to a better neighbourhood, a slightly nicer street, a slightly better life. The future she'd been building towards since she was 14 years old, finally starting to take shape. She was, by all accounts, absolutely delighted. Israel, however, overheard her telling a neighbour about the move. And for him, that was it. The collapse. The end of everything. Not because anything real had ended, but because the future he'd constructed entirely in his own imagination, the one where Miriam eventually came round, left her husband, chose him, that future had an expiry date now. She was leaving. He sat alone in his room that evening, staring at the cracked wallpaper. And somewhere in that room, admiration became obsession, and obsession became something considerably darker. He convinced himself she had deceived him, led him on, ruined his life. Admittedly, the entire courtship had taken place inside his own head, but Israel was no longer particularly interested in that technicality. The next night, Israel Lipski entered Miriam Angel's room. We don't know exactly what he said. We know voices were raised, the neighbours heard through the thin walls. We know Miriam told him to leave. He didn't leave. Within minutes, Miriam Angel, 22 years old, weeks away from the life she'd spent years building, was dead. Killed with nitric acid. The spell reached the neighbours almost immediately. The body was found shortly after. Israel was discovered nearby, claiming mysterious intruders had attacked them both, that he was also a victim, that none of it was his fault. The neighbours who'd heard the argument were not especially convinced by this version of events. Neither was anyone else. The trial at the Old Bailey became a national spectacle, because of course it did. Victorian Britain did love a sensational murder, almost as much as it loved arguing about one. Lipski's defence painted him as a scapegoat, a desperate immigrant being railroaded by a system already biased against him. The evidence, they argued, was circumstantial. The prosecution pointed out that the evidence was not, in fact, very circumstantial at all. The jury agreed with the prosecution. Guilty. Death. Petitions were filed. Pleas for clemency went to the Home Secretary. The public argued in the papers for weeks. The law remained unmoved. On August 20th, 1887, Israel Lipski was hanged at Newgate Prison. And here's the part of the story that genuinely gets me. After the execution,
the name Lipski didn't fade quietly into history. It became a slur. For years, decades, in the streets of the East End, Lipski was what you shouted at an outsider, a troublemaker, someone who didn't belong.
A name that had once belonged to a real person became a punishment handed out to strangers. Miriam Angel, meanwhile, the woman who was actually killed, the woman whose only crime was being kind to a neighbour, got considerably less attention. History remembered the killer's name. It took considerably longer to remember hers. She was 22. She'd worked since she was 14. She'd built something from nothing, in a language she'd taught herself, in a city that hadn't exactly rolled out the welcome mat. And she deserved a lot better than what she got. From Israel Lipski, from the coverage, from history. Right, that's the Lipski case. Leave a comment if you've got thoughts. And if a neighbour starts timing their trips to the water pump to coincide with yours, maybe consider moving sooner rather than later. See you next time.